I died on a Thursday. My back hit the marble first. Then my skull cracked against the balcony floor. Blood pooled beneath me, warm, then cooling fast. 30 floors below, the city glittered like nothing had happened. I heard heels on stone. Slow. Unhurried. Like a woman strolling through a garden. That sound followed me into the dark. There was one name I whispered before everything went black. Nobody heard it. But I did. And I would use it again. In this life. Before anyone else knew I remembered. I woke up gasping, sheets tangled around my legs. Sunlight cut through thin curtains. Dust drifted in the beam, slow and golden. My hands looked wrong. Smooth. Unscarred. 19 years old again. The smell hit me next. Lemon polish on old wood. My mother's rose garden, faint through the window screen. Not the perfume. Not yet. Just roses, real ones, growing in dirt. I sat up slowly. My heart still hammered from the fall that hadn't happened yet. I pressed a hand to my chest and felt it beating. Whole, unbroken. I was home. I was young. I was 5 years before the balcony. There was one thing I knew that no one else in this house did. I knew exactly how I was going to die. And I knew exactly who was going to make sure of it. I got dressed with steady hands. Downstairs, I could already smell it. Rose perfume, thick and sweet, clinging to the hallway air. My stepmother's signature scent. In my old life, that smell meant she was close. Now it meant something else. It meant I had time to prepare. Diane Marsh sat at the breakfast table like a queen holding court. Her daughter Vivian sat beside her, scrolling through her phone, bored already. Neither of them looked up when I walked in. "You're late," Diane said, not looking at me. "Your father's lawyer called. Something about the Hartwell Trust." I poured my own coffee. My hand did not shake. "I'll call him back." Vivian glanced up then, lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Don't strain yourself, Elena. Legal things give you headaches. Remember?" I remembered a lot of things. I remembered her voice saying the exact same words, 5 years from now. In a hospital hallway, right before she had me declared unfit. I smiled instead of flinching. "I'll manage," I said. That was the first small crack in the world I used to know. Vivian didn't notice it yet. She would. Later. When it was far too late to matter. My father had been dead 3 years in this timeline, same as before. Heart attack, they said. Sudden. At his desk. Papers still in his hand. I used to believe that story completely. Now I wasn't so sure it was the whole truth. But that was a thread for later. I had other fires to light first. Diane had married my father 2 years before he died. She brought Vivian with her, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. In my old life, I thought grief made me slow to see her clearly. This time, grief wasn't going to slow me down at all. I finished my coffee and set the cup down without a sound. "I have an appointment this afternoon," I said. "With Mr. Okafor." Diane's eyes flicked up at that name. Grant Okafor had been my father's personal attorney. In my old life, Diane eased him out within a year, replaced him with her own man. I wasn't going to let that happen twice. "Whatever for?" Diane asked, voice light as ash. "Trust business," I said. "Boring things. Legal things." I let Vivian's own words land back on her, soft as a blade slipping between ribs. "You know how they give me headaches." Vivian's smile faltered, just barely. She didn't understand yet. She would. Grant Okafor's office smelled like old leather and stronger coffee than I could drink. Rain tapped the window in a steady rhythm. A clock ticked somewhere behind his desk, precise and patient. He looked older than I remembered from 5 years ahead. Though, of course, to him, we'd never met at all. Not yet. Not in this version of things. "Your father trusted very few people," he said, folding his hands. "He trusted me with your mother's trust. The Hartwell Trust. It's separate from the family estate." "I know," I said. "I want to make it separate from everyone." He studied me for a long moment. "You're 19, Miss Hart. I'm aware. Most 19-year-olds don't walk in asking to lock an irrevocable trust before anyone can touch it. I met his eyes without blinking. Most 19-year-olds haven't watched what happens when they wait too long. He didn't ask what I meant by that. Lawyers rarely do, when the client already sounds certain. He simply reached for a fresh legal pad and started writing. That was the first move. Quiet. Small. Nobody would feel it for years. There was one thing Diane didn't know about that meeting. I'll get to that later. I left his office as the rain thickened outside. Somewhere in this city, a man named Julian Voss was still 4 years away from becoming my fiancé and 5 years away from watching me fall. I intended to make full use of every one of those days. The engagement had been arranged before I was born, a pact between my father and Julian's father, two old friends building empires side by side. Hart Textiles supplied fabric. Voss Holdings supplied capital. The marriage was meant to braid the two together forever. In my old life, I believed it was destiny. Now I knew it was bait. Voss Holdings looked like gold from the outside. Marble lobby, glass tower, a name people whispered with envy. Underneath, it was rotting. I'd learned the truth only in my final months alive, pieced together from panicked phone calls and locked filing cabinets. Voss Holdings owed money to men who did not send invoices. They sent enforcers instead. Julian's father had borrowed from a man named Rourke, and Rourke's patience had limits. By the time I understood any of it, I was already engaged to inherit that debt through marriage. And then I was dead, and it was someone else's problem. Except it wasn't going to be my problem at all, not this time. It was going to be Vivian's. I walked home slowly, letting the plan settle into my bones. I wasn't going to fight Vivian for Julian. I was going to hand him to her, gift-wrapped, and step back to watch her open the box. 2 weeks later, Julian Voss came to dinner for the first time in this life. I remembered his cologne before I remembered his face. Sandalwood, warm and expensive, curling through the dining room like smoke, it hit me like a fist to the chest. My stomach turned over. For one dizzying second I was back on that balcony, cold marble under my spine, his shoes just out of reach, doing nothing while I bled. I breathed through it. Nobody at the table noticed. I had gotten very good. Very fast. At wearing a calm face over a screaming one. "Elena," Julian said, taking the seat across from me. "You look well." "I feel well," I said. It wasn't a lie. Not anymore. Vivian leaned forward, chin propped on her hand, watching him the way a cat watches a bird through glass. She laughed at everything he said that night. Loud, bright, deliberate. I let her have the whole performance. When Julian asked about my studies, I gave short answers. When he complimented my dress, I thanked him and changed the subject. I was building something with every flat, uninterested word. Boredom is its own kind of architecture. Diane noticed before Vivian did. She always noticed money moving in the wrong direction. "You've gone quiet on him," she said later, after Julian left, rose perfume thick in the hallway air between us. "That boy is worth $200 million, Elena." "On paper," I said. She tilted her head, thin smile in place. "What else would it be worth on?" I didn't answer that. I just smiled back, the same empty smile she'd worn at my funeral in another life, and walked upstairs. Behind me, I heard her murmur something to Vivian. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew the shape of them. That was villain escalation number 1. Small, quiet, almost polite. Diane began telling people I was cold, distant, not quite right in the head. It would grow. Everything with Diane grew, slow and patient, like mold behind a wall. I let it grow. I had bigger walls to build behind. The next morning, I made one phone call. Just one. To a number I had memorized in my previous life and never forgotten. It rang twice before she picked up. "Reyes," a voice said, clipped and tired. "Nora Reyes," I said. "My name is Elena Hart. You don't know me yet." A pause. Yet is an odd word to use with a stranger. "I have information about Voss Holdings," I said. "Federal-grade information." I need someone who won't sell it to the wrong side before I'm ready to use it. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear her considering, weighing the strangeness of the call against the specificity of what I'd said. People in her line of work learn to trust specificity. "Where do we meet?" she asked. I didn't tell my family about that meeting. I didn't tell them about Grant Okafor's private files, or the trust papers quietly locking themselves away from Diane's reach. Vivian thought I was sulking over Julian. Let her think that. There was a document in my coat pocket that week. One I'd had Grant draft in secret. It burned against my ribs the entire drive home. Diane would find out what was in it eventually. Just not yet. 6 months passed like that. Small moves. Invisible from the outside. Julian's visits continued, and every time, I stepped back half an inch further, and Vivian stepped forward to fill the space. She thought she was winning. She was walking into a house on fire, admiring the wallpaper. I should have felt something, watching her fall for it so easily. Guilt, maybe. Hesitation. I felt neither. I'd learned that particular kind of stillness the hard way, on cold marble, listening to her heels walk away. The contract came up at dinner on a rainy Tuesday. Diane read it off her phone like a woman announcing a lottery win. "The engagement paperwork," she said. "Julian's father wants it finalized within 90 days. Something about restructuring before a merger. 90 days. I filed that number away carefully. A deadline was a gift, if you knew how to use one. "I don't want it," I said simply. "Let Vivian have him." The table went silent. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Vivian's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Diane's eyes narrowed, searching my face for the trick she was certain must be there. "You don't want $200 million. Diane said slowly. "I don't want him," I said. "There's a difference, ask Vivian. She's wanted him since the first dinner." Vivian's cheeks went pink, caught between triumph and suspicion. I watched both feelings cross her face like weather. She wanted to believe me too badly to keep doubting for long. "You're serious," she said. "Completely," I said. "Consider it an early wedding gift." I smiled when I said it. A small, generous smile, the kind that looks like surrender. Nobody at that table understood what they were actually looking at. I wasn't giving anything away. I was loading a gun and handing it to the person I intended to watch pull the trigger on herself. That night, alone in my room, I finally let myself breathe. My hands trembled, just slightly, adrenaline draining out of me like water from a cracked glass. The hardest part wasn't lying. The hardest part was smiling while I did it. But that wasn't the worst part of that year. Not even close. The 90-day clock started the next morning. Diane moved fast once she smelled the scent of money changing hands. She called Julian's father directly, rearranged seating charts, ordered new dresses. Vivian floated through the house like she'd already won a war nobody else was fighting. I let her float. I had my own calls to make. Grant Okafor met me twice that month, always with the door closed and the blinds down. The second time, he slid a folder across his desk, thin but heavy with meaning. "The Hartwell Trust is fully separated," he said. "Irrevocable. Your stepmother cannot touch a cent of it, no matter what she signs." "And the Hart Textiles shares," I said. "My father's shares." "Still vulnerable," he said. "Diane controls the board seat until you turn 25. Unless..." "Unless what?" He looked at me for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone he's starting to respect and fear in equal measure. "Unless we find a legal reason to move the date up. Fraud. Usually. Or incompetence on the guardian's part." I almost laughed. "Almost. Give me time," I said. "I'll find you both." He didn't ask how I could sound so certain about something that hadn't happened yet. I was starting to notice that good lawyers rarely ask the question they're afraid of hearing answered honestly. Nora Reyes was a different kind of ally. Younger than I remembered her being. Sharper too, still climbing instead of established. She met me in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and frying oil, sliding into the booth across from me like she did this every week. "Voss Holdings," she said, no greeting. "You said federal grade. That's a big word for a college student." "I read," I said. And I listen. Julian's father borrowed heavily from a man named Rourke. Off the books. If you pull the shipping manifests from the last 2 years, you'll find inventory numbers that don't match invoices. Her eyebrows rose slightly. That's oddly specific for a guess. It's not a guess, I said. She studied me the way a good investigator studies anything too neat to be an accident. I let her look. I needed her curious, not comfortable. Curious people dig. Comfortable people stop. I'll look into it, she said finally. Quietly. Quietly, I agreed. For now. I walked out into the cold with the beginnings of a machine assembled in my mind. A lawyer sealing my mother's money away from grasping hands. An investigator sniffing along a trail that would one day lead straight to a federal raid. A stepsister racing gleefully toward a debt she didn't know existed. 3 moving pieces. None of them had met each other yet. None of them needed to, not for a long time. That was the whole point. The engagement party landed on a Saturday in early spring. Diane spared no expense. Chandeliers dripped light across the ballroom floor. Champagne glasses caught the glow and threw it back in fractured little stars. I wore gray. Vivian wore ivory, the color meant for brides, though technically the ring on her finger was mine to have refused. She'd taken to it faster than I expected. Faster than even Diane had planned for. Julian's cologne reached me before he did, sandalwood cutting through perfume and champagne. My stomach clenched, an old bruise pressed too hard. I forced my shoulders to stay loose. You seem happy for us, he said, standing beside me at the edge of the crowd. There was something searching in his voice, like he half expected a different answer. I am, I said. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was happy. Just not for the reasons he assumed. He studied me for a moment, sandalwood and champagne, and the low murmur of violins behind him. You've changed, he said quietly. Since we were kids. Everyone changes, I said. He didn't push further. Somewhere behind him, Vivian's laugh rang out, bright and performative, drawing eyes the way she always wanted them drawn. I watched her work the room like she owned it already. In a way, soon enough, she would. Just not in the way she imagined. That was villain escalation number 2. Not cruelty exactly. Just theft, dressed up as celebration. She had taken my seat at that table, my ring, my future, and she wore it all like she'd earned it fair and square. I raised my glass when Diane made the toast. I even smiled for the photographs. Nobody in that ballroom knew they were standing inside the opening act of a collapse that would take 3 more years to finish falling. There was a man in a gray suit near the bar that night, watching the room a little too carefully for a stranger. I recognized the posture before I recognized the face. I knew exactly who had sent him. Though I said nothing to anyone. Not yet. That thread would tighten later, and when it did, it would matter more than anyone at that party could imagine. By the time the engagement moved from Elena Hart to Vivian Marsh on paper, 90 days had come and gone twice over, folded into a longer, colder engagement of my own making. Vivian's wedding date was set for 18 months out. Voss Holdings needed the merger money by then, or the whole structure would buckle. I had 18 months. I intended to use every week of them like a blade being sharpened, slow and patient, until it could cut without anyone hearing the sound. Vivian moved into a new apartment that spring, a wedding gift from Diane, paid for partly with Hart Textiles money that wasn't technically Diane's to spend. I watched her unpack boxes of silk dresses and imported perfume with the kind of joy that comes from believing you've finally escaped someone else's shadow. She didn't know she was standing in a different shadow entirely. One with teeth. I visited once, early on, mostly to see how comfortable she'd gotten. Her new apartment smelled like her mother's, thick with rose perfume, and something else underneath it, something sharper. Champagne going flat in the sink. Wealth performed rather than earned. You should be happier for me, Vivian said, sprawled across a white couch that cost more than most people's cars. I am happy, I said, and meant it in my own particular way. She narrowed her eyes slightly, studying me the way Diane always did, hunting for the trick. You're strange lately, Elena. Distant. Mother says you might need to see someone. There it was. The seed Diane had been planting for months. Finally pushing up through soil in Vivian's mouth. I let it land without flinching. Maybe I do, I said lightly. Grief does odd things. She seemed satisfied by that, settling back into her cushions, already bored of me again. I left her apartment smelling like rose perfume and unearned silk, and I did not look back once on my way down the stairs. That was the moment I decided the pace needed to change. Watching wasn't enough anymore. It was time to start pulling threads that Vivian and Diane could feel tugging, even if they didn't yet understand where the tension was coming from. I met Grant again on a Tuesday. Rain sliding down his office windows in long, patient lines. The smell of old leather chairs and stronger coffee had become almost comforting by then, a room where I never had to pretend anything. The board seat transfers when I turned 25, he reminded me, unless we build a case sooner. Build it, I said. Start with the signature on the March transfer documents. I don't think that's my stepmother's handwriting matching the notary date. He went very still. You think it's forged. I know it's forged, I said. I just need you to prove it before she notices I already do. He didn't ask how I knew. He simply reached for his pen, the scratch of it against paper steady and precise, like a clock counting down towards something neither of us said aloud yet. I made a second phone call that same week, to Nora Reyes, who by then had grown a little sharper, a little more convinced that the strange college student with the specific tips was worth taking seriously. The manifests you asked about, she said, without preamble, the moment I picked up. They're off. Way off. Somebody's been moving product that doesn't officially exist. Rourke, I said. You keep saying that name like you're sure, she said. I haven't confirmed it yet. You will, I said. Give it time. She was quiet for a moment. You scare me a little, Elena Hart. Good, I said. That means you're paying attention. I hung up smiling. The first real smile I'd allowed myself in weeks. The machine had 3 working parts now, each one turning slowly, invisibly, under the surface of a life that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than a quiet girl staying out of her family's business. But I wasn't staying out of anything. I was building the walls of the room they were all about to be trapped inside. There was a document I slipped into Vivian's purse that same month when she wasn't looking, folded small enough to disappear among lipsticks and receipts. She wouldn't find it for a long time. She would find it at exactly the right moment. I made sure of that. Diane hosted a dinner not long after, one of her performances disguised as hospitality, meant to show off Vivian's engagement ring to half the city's old money. Waiters moved silently between tables, carrying trays of champagne that caught the chandelier light like scattered coins. I sat near the end of the table, mostly ignored, exactly where I wanted to be. Julian sat across from Vivian, his sandalwood cologne threading faintly through the smell of roasted lamb and candle wax. My stomach still twisted at it, an old wound that hadn't fully closed. To the happy couple, Diane said, raising her glass, rose perfume drifting toward me like smoke off a fire I remembered too well. Everyone drank. I drank too, though the champagne tasted like nothing at all. Later that night, walking to my car alone, I noticed the same man in the gray suit again, leaning near a parked sedan across the street. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. I already understood the message being sent, quiet and deliberate, from a man named Rourke who had started to feel the first faint tremors of the trap I was building beneath his money. I got into my car without hurrying. My hands were steady on the wheel. Somewhere behind me, I could still hear Diane's laughter drifting through the open dining room windows, bright and untroubled, completely unaware of how loudly her own house had begun to creak. The first crack came 4 months later, small and easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. Diane's assistant called Vivian's apartment, flustered, asking about a wire transfer that had bounced back twice. Vivian dismissed it as a bank error. I knew better. I'd made one quiet phone call the week before, flagging an irregularity on a shared account that technically still bore my father's old signature authority. It wasn't sabotage exactly. It was simply the truth, reported to the right department. At the right time. Vivian complained about it over lunch, oblivious, stirring her tea with the same restless energy she'd had as a teenager. Banks are so incompetent lately, she said. Terrible, I agreed, and said nothing else. That was pattern interrupt number 1, though nobody but me recognized it as an interrupt at all. A single dropped call in an otherwise smooth, glittering engagement, easy to explain away, easy to forget. Except it wouldn't be the last one. Not by a long way. I should have known then how fast the rest would fall once the first domino tipped. I should have guessed how little warning anyone would get. But that story comes later, and it comes faster than anyone standing in that dining room could have imagined. I found my own small corner of the city that year, a walk-up apartment 2 miles from the estate, paid for entirely with my own earnings from a design job at a fabric house Diane knew nothing about. The floor creaked in the hallway. The radiator hissed at odd hours. I loved every imperfect inch of it. A woman named Priya lived across the hall, a seamstress with flour-dusted hands from the bakery she worked mornings before her real job started. She knocked on my door the first week, offering a warm loaf wrapped in a dish towel, still steaming faintly in the cold hallway air. "You looked like you needed this," she said, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal at all. I hadn't cried once since waking up in this life, not through funerals or forged signatures or sandalwood cologne catching me off guard at dinner tables. I nearly cried then, over warm bread and a stranger's simple kindness. I didn't tell her why. We became friends slowly, the honest kind, built over shared coffee and evenings spent hemming curtains at her kitchen table. She never asked about my family's money. She never once made me feel small for wanting quiet, plain things instead of chandeliers. Some evenings I sat on my fire escape with a cup of tea gone lukewarm, watching pigeons settle along the rooftop opposite mine, and I understood, clearly, that this small life was never the consolation prize. It was the actual reward. Everything else was simply the trap I was still busy setting. I printed the first batch of evidence documents in Priya's building basement. An ancient copier that groaned and rattled with every page. The smell of hot ink and warm paper filled the small room. Each sheet felt heavier in my hands than its weight should have allowed. I saved digital copies too, 3 separate drives hidden in 3 separate places, none of them inside my own apartment. Old habits from a life that ended in a locked filing cabinet nobody thought to search until it no longer mattered. Grant called me 8 months into that 18-month countdown, his voice tighter than usual over the phone. "I found something," he said. "The March transfer. It's forged, Elena. Cleanly, but forged." "Diane," I said. "Not a question." "Diane," he confirmed. "Which means we have grounds. Fraud against a minor beneficiary's estate, technically, given the date. It's not enough to move fast yet. But it's enough to start building." "Then build," I said. Quietly. "I don't want her to feel anything yet." "When do you want her to feel it?" he asked. I looked out my window at the rose bushes my mother had planted years before either of us knew what was coming. "When it's too late for her to stop it," I said. Nora called 2 weeks after that, her voice lower than usual, careful, the way people get when they've found something they're not sure how to say out loud yet. "I need you to come in," she said. "Not over the phone." We met in the same diner, burnt coffee, and frying oil thick in the air. She slid a folder across the table, thinner than Grant's, but somehow heavier. "Rourke's real," she said. "Voss Holdings owes him $11 million, give or take. The kind of debt that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. The kind that gets collected in ways that don't involve lawyers." I opened the folder slowly, scanning numbers I already knew by heart from another life, watching them made real and provable in this one. "How long until it collapses on its own?" I asked. "Hard to say," Nora said. "Companies like this can limp along for years if nobody pushes. Or they can go overnight, if the wrong person gets impatient." "He'll get impatient," I said. "Soon enough. I intend to help." She studied me across the table, coffee steam curling between us. "You keep talking like you're steering a car that hasn't crashed yet," she said. "Like you already know exactly where the curve is." "I do," I said simply. She didn't ask how. I liked that about her. Some people know better than to reach for an answer that might change everything they think they understand about the world. There was a wedding dress fitting that same week. 3 towns over. Silken pins and mirrors under harsh white light. Vivian twirled in front of the glass, radiant, oblivious, wrapped in fabric that would soon carry the smell of a fortune coming apart at the seams. "You're so quiet these days," she said, catching my reflection behind hers. "Almost like you're planning something." My pulse didn't even jump. I'd had practice by then. "I'm planning your wedding gift," I said, and smiled when she laughed, delighted, completely unaware of how true that sentence actually was. The second act of that 18 months belonged almost entirely to villain escalation. Vivian, flush with borrowed confidence, began treating me the way Diane always had, small cruelties dressed up as jokes, delivered in front of company so I couldn't respond without looking bitter. She mocked my clothes at a charity gala, calling them practical in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. Julian laughed along, sandalwood and champagne thick in the air, and something old and cold twisted low in my stomach. That was villain escalation number 3, and it landed harder than the first two combined, precisely because it happened in public, in front of people whose opinions Diane cared about. I smiled through it anyway. I had learned to smile through worse. I should have known that laughter never stays harmless for long once it starts finding an audience. I should have braced myself sooner for what came after. But even I underestimated how far Vivian was willing to go once she believed she had nothing left to fear from me. The forged signature surfaced properly 6 weeks before the wedding, though not the way Grant and I had planned to reveal it. Diane found out I'd separated the Hartwell trust completely, locked far beyond her reach, and something in her calm, practiced mask finally slipped. She confronted me in the kitchen, rose perfume thick enough to choke on, her voice low and dangerous in a way I remembered from another lifetime, right before everything there had gone wrong too. "You went behind my back," she said. "I went to my own lawyer," I said. "About my own mother's money. That's not behind anyone's back. You'll regret this," she said, and for a moment her mask cracked wide enough that I saw exactly what was underneath it. Something hungry. Something that had never once, in either life, actually loved me at all. I didn't flinch. "I doubt it," I said, and walked out of the kitchen before she could see just how true that answer really was. That night, Diane and Vivian decided together, in whispered voices behind a closed door I happened to be standing near, that something needed to be done about me before I caused real problems for the wedding. I didn't hear every word. I didn't need to. I already knew, roughly, the shape of what came next, because it had happened to me once already, in a version of this story where I never got the chance to prepare. This time, I was ready for it. This time, when the blow came, it was going to land on an opponent who'd been waiting for it. Not one caught by surprise on cold marble with nowhere left to fall. The blow came 3 days later, in the form of a locked front gate and a stranger's face at my bedroom door. Diane had filed papers, quietly, quickly, claiming instability, citing rumors she'd spent a year and a half planting like seeds in soft ground. "It's for your own good," Diane said, standing in the doorway with 2 men behind her I didn't recognize. "Just a short evaluation. Doctor's orders." I looked past her at the men, calm on the outside, ice cold underneath. "Who's doctor?" I asked. "Does it matter?" Diane said. It mattered enormously. It was the single cruelest thing she'd done yet, worse than gossip, worse than forged signatures, an attempt to erase my voice entirely under the excuse of care. That was villain escalation number 4. And it very nearly worked exactly as intended. Except I had already called Grant 20 minutes earlier, the moment I'd overheard the whispered plan through that closed door days before. He arrived before the men could finish their sentence, folder in hand, calm as a man holding a winning card he'd been saving for months. "This evaluation order is invalid," he said, voice flat and precise. "It relies on a forged document. I have the forensic report right here." Diane's face went the color of old paper. For the first time since I'd known her in either life, she had absolutely nothing to say. I stepped past all of them, out into the hallway, out into air that smelled like rose perfume trying desperately to cover the scent of something rotting underneath. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The look on her face said everything I needed to hear. There was one thing Diane still didn't know. The forensic report Grant carried wasn't the only file we'd built. It was simply the first one we'd chosen to show her. Vivian avoided me for 2 full weeks after that, embarrassed, or afraid, or both. I let the silence sit undisturbed. Silence, at that point in the plan, was doing more work than words ever could have. The wedding date crept closer. 30 days out. Then 20. Then 12. Voss Holdings had begun preparing for the merger meant to save it, papers signed, press releases drafted, all of it timed to land right after Vivian said her vows. I received one final phone call from Nora before the countdown truly began, her voice carrying an edge of adrenaline she didn't bother hiding. "The federal audit is moving," she said. "Someone tipped them earlier than expected." "Good," I said. "It wasn't me," she said carefully. "Was it you?" I let the silence answer for me, just long enough to be its own kind of confession. 12 days, I said instead. "Can it move fast enough to matter in 12 days? "If it doesn't," she said, "I have a feeling you'll find a way to make it." She wasn't wrong. She rarely was, by that point. I hung up the phone and looked out at my mother's roses one more time, blooming stubbornly despite everything happening around them, and I understood, with total clarity, that the next 12 days would decide everything. The clock had finally started its final countdown, and this time, unlike before, I was the one holding the trigger. 12 days became 7, and 7 became 3, and the house filled with the particular chaos of a wedding no one inside it truly understood the danger of anymore. Florists arrived with white roses that made my stomach turn for reasons that had nothing to do with allergies. Caterers argued over menus in a kitchen that smelled like butter and rising bread, warm and domestic and utterly deceptive. Grant called on day 3, his voice tight with the particular calm of a man about to move very quickly. "The forensic report on the signature is finalized," he said. "Filed. Sealed until we choose to unseal it." "Hold it," I said. "Not yet." Nora called an hour later, breathless in a way I'd never heard from her before. "The raid's authorized," she said. "Voss Holdings. They're moving on the wedding day itself. Guests, press, everyone in one place at once." "They chose the day," I said. "Not me." "Convenient timing," she said, and I could hear the small, dry smile in her voice. Almost like someone leaked exactly which day would draw the biggest crowd. I said nothing to that. Some silences are their own kind of answer, and I'd grown very comfortable letting mine speak for me by then. There was a moment, alone in my room the night before the wedding, when the old fear crept back in uninvited. Sandalwood cologne. Rose perfume. Cold marble under my spine. I sat very still until it passed, breathing slow, reminding myself that this time the balcony belonged to someone else's downfall entirely. That was the last quiet moment of that entire year. What happened next moved faster than anything before it, and none of them ever saw it coming until it had already swallowed them whole. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and merciless, sunlight bouncing off white tents set up across the Voss estate lawn. I wore navy, deliberately understated, while 200 guests in silk and diamonds filled rows of gilded chairs. Vivian looked radiant walking down the aisle, veil catching the light like spun glass, utterly unaware that every guarantee she believed in was already dissolving somewhere behind the scenes. Julian waited at the altar, sandalwood cologne, carrying faintly on the breeze, his smile the practiced kind men wear when they've stopped feeling much of anything. I sat in the third row, hands folded, watching the ceremony with the calm of someone reading the final page of a book they'd already finished writing. The vows had barely started when a phone buzzed somewhere near the back rows. Then another. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd, the particular sound of 200 people realizing something at once. I didn't need to check my own phone. I already knew what the headline said. Voss Holdings under federal investigation for money laundering, the article read, published exactly 7 minutes before the vows began, timed by a journalist who owed Nora Reyes a very old favor. That was public exposure, delivered at the precise moment it would do the most damage. The murmur grew louder. Guests exchanged glances instead of watching the altar. Diane's face, visible from where I sat, drained of color in real time, rose perfume doing nothing to mask the sudden sour smell of panic. That wasn't the worst part. Not even close to it. 3 black sedans pulled up along the estate's gravel drive less than 10 minutes later, doors opening in perfect, practiced sync. Federal agents moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, badges out, voices low but absolutely unmistakable in their authority. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. Vivian turned, veil trembling, confusion cracking across her carefully painted face. Julian's hand slipped from hers without either of them seeming to notice. "Julian Voss," one agent said, stepping toward the altar itself. "We need a word." I watched Julian's expression shift through disbelief, then fear, then something close to recognition, as if some old instinct in him finally understood exactly what kind of storm he'd been standing in the eye of for years. Diane bolted for the parking area before anyone could stop her, heels clattering against gravel, rose perfume trailing behind her like smoke from something already burning. She didn't get far. Grant Okafor stood near the entrance, folder in hand, flanked by a process server whose timing could not have been more precise. Diane Marshhart, the server said, holding out an envelope. She refused to take it first. You're being served. Fraud. Forgery. Attempted unlawful guardianship. Diane's hands finally shook, visibly, for the first time I had ever witnessed in either version of my life. The document slipped from the server's grip and landed at her feet, and she stared down at it like it might bite her. Vivian, still standing at the altar in her ruined white dress, turned to find me in the crowd. Her eyes found mine across 200 stunned faces, and something in her expression finally cracked wide open. You knew, she said, voice carrying across the sudden silence. You knew this whole time. I rose from my seat slowly, smoothing my navy dress, and walked toward the altar with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment for years without ever writing a single line down. I knew, I said simply, since the day you first put on that ring. The crowd around us seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting, hungry for whatever came next. I let them wait a moment longer, savoring nothing, feeling nothing close to triumph, only a long, cold clarity finally settling into place. Vivian's makeup had already begun to run, mascara tracking dark lines down cheeks that had been flawless 20 minutes earlier. Her hands trembled around her bouquet, white roses wilting faster than flowers should in mere minutes of sun. You did this to me, she said, voice cracking. You planned this. I planned nothing that wasn't already true, I said. The debt was already there. The fraud was already there. I only made sure the truth arrived on time. Diane, still frozen near the parking lot with an unsigned envelope at her feet, found her voice at last, thin and furious. You destroyed us for spite, she said. For a grudge over a dead man's money. I turned toward her, and for the first time in either life, I let her see exactly how little her accusations meant to me anymore. I destroyed nothing, I said. You built this yourselves. I only stopped protecting you from it. The rose perfume around her had gone stale in the heat, sweetness curdling into something almost sour. I noticed it distinctly, the way a scent I'd once associated with fear now simply smelled like an old woman losing everything she'd stolen. Julian stood apart from all of it, agents flanking him, sandalwood cologne barely registering any more against the chaos of the collapsing tent behind him. He looked at me once, something like recognition finally surfacing in his eyes. You knew about my father's debts, he said quietly. From the beginning. I knew everything, I said. You just never bothered to ask the right person. He didn't answer that. There wasn't really an answer left to give. Behind him, an agent gestured toward one of the sedans, and Julian went without much resistance, sandalwood cologne fading into gravel dust and distance. The information gap I had carried for years finally closed completely in that moment, spread out across a ruined wedding tent for everyone to see. I hadn't just let Vivian take a poisoned gift. I had spent every day since waking up building the exact machinery that would make sure it exploded on schedule. Vivian sank onto the altar steps, veil crumpled around her, white dress smeared with dust and gravel. Why, she whispered, not really asking anyone, not really expecting an answer at all. I gave her one anyway. Because in another life, I said. You did the exact same thing to me, and nobody was watching closely enough to stop it. Her eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering underneath the panic, as if some small, buried part of her recognized a truth she couldn't possibly consciously remember. I didn't explain further. Some truths only need to be spoken once to do their work. Diane finally picked up the envelope at her feet, hands shaking too badly to open it properly. Grant approached her calmly, voice even, professional, utterly without mercy. You'll want a lawyer of your own, he said. I'd recommend someone experienced with forgery cases. And, separately, someone experienced with older, unsolved deaths. Diane went very still at that last phrase, stiller than the fraud accusation had made her. I watched something old and guilty surface behind her eyes, something that had nothing to do with signatures or trust funds at all. That was the moment the second trap finally revealed itself, quiet and devastating, folded inside everything else like a blade hidden in silk. Priya found me later that same afternoon, waiting near my car at the edge of the estate lawn, flowers still faintly dusted along one sleeve from the morning bakery shift. She hadn't been invited to the wedding. She'd come anyway, the moment I called her that morning and told her simply to be nearby. "You look like you need this," she said, holding out a small paper bag, warm bread wrapped inside a dish towel, exactly like the first week we'd met. I laughed then. The first real laugh I'd allowed myself in months, startled and unguarded. It felt strange in my throat, like a muscle finally remembering how to move after being clenched too long. "Perfect timing," I said. "I try," she said, and looped her arm through mine, steering me gently away from the chaos still unfolding behind us near the altar. There was one more piece to the machine I had built, one I hadn't shared with Grant or Nora or anyone else until exactly this moment. My mother's death, years before any of this began, had never actually been ruled a heart attack in my old life. It had simply been ruled convenient. Nora appeared beside Diane then, badge out, voice level and unhurried. "Diane Marsh-Hart," she said. "We'd also like to speak with you about the death of Margaret Hart. New evidence has come to light regarding medication records from that year." Diane's knees buckled slightly, caught by the agent beside her before she hit the gravel. Rose perfume drifted off her in waves now, sour and desperate, nothing like the confident scent she'd worn for years like armor. I hadn't been entirely certain that peace would surface in time. In my old life, I never lived long enough to find out the full truth about my mother at all. This time, I'd sent Nora looking quietly, months earlier, toward old pharmacy records nobody had thought to double-check. The final twist wasn't the fraud. It wasn't even the money laundering, or the forged signature, or the wedding collapsing in real time under a summer sun. It was this. The woman who raised me for 3 years, wearing grief like a costume, had likely helped clear my real mother out of the way long before I was ever old enough to notice anything was wrong. I hadn't known that for certain when I woke up 5 years earlier. I had only suspected it. A cold, formless instinct from a life cut short before I could confirm anything. This time, I'd had years to make certain instinct became evidence. Vivian, still slumped on the altar steps, looked up at her mother with something breaking wide open across her face. "Is it true?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, is any of that true?" Diane didn't answer her daughter. She didn't answer anyone. She simply stared at the gravel beneath her ruined shoes, rose perfume finally, completely, gone stale in the summer heat. I stood in the middle of all of it, veilless, dry-eyed, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all. Not triumph. Not relief. Just a long, quiet stillness, the kind that comes after a storm finally runs out of rain. Agents led Diane toward one of the black sedans, her heels dragging slightly against the gravel, the sound nothing like the confident click I remembered from my own death. Vivian remained on the altar steps. Alone now. Wedding dress ruined. Future collapsing around her in real time. She looked up at me once more before I turned to leave. "What do I do now?" she asked, voice small in a way I'd never once heard from her, in either life. I considered several answers. Cruel ones. Kind ones. In the end, I gave her the only one that was entirely true. "You survive it," I said. The same way I did. I didn't wait for a reply. There wasn't going to be one worth hearing. 3 weeks later, the last pieces finished settling into place, quiet and inevitable, the way dust finally finds the floor after a long fall. Voss Holdings filed for bankruptcy protection, Rourke's debt exposed alongside the federal charges, the glass tower emptied of employees within days. Julian took a plea deal for lesser charges, his father's crimes weighing heavier than his own, though the sandalwood cologne I'd once feared no longer meant anything to me at all when I passed him, briefly, once, outside a courthouse hallway. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Diane's trial for the forged trust documents moved quickly, evidence too clean for delay. The investigation into my mother's death moved slower, methodical, the kind of case built to actually hold in court rather than simply satisfy old grief. I let Nora and the prosecutors handle that thread with the patience it deserved. Vivian sold the white apartment within a month, silk dresses and imported perfume packed into boxes far smaller than the life she'd imagined for herself. I heard she moved to a smaller city, took a job answering phones somewhere, and I felt nothing sharp about that at all. Just a distant, settled kind of quiet. Grant finalized my full control over the Hartwell Trust. The same week Diane's trial began, the paperwork clean, the timeline unquestionable in either direction. I signed the final documents with a steady hand, the same hand that had trembled, just slightly, the very first night I decided to let Vivian take everything I offered her. Nora and I met one last time at the old diner, burnt coffee still terrible, frying oil still thick in the air. She studied me across the table with the particular look of someone who had spent 2 years wondering about a question she'd finally decided to ask out loud. "How did you know?" she said. "All of it. From the very beginning." I thought about lying. I thought about telling her some clever half-truth about instinct or family gossip or careful observation. In the end, I simply told her the truth, plain and unadorned, the way I'd learned to speak it over the last 2 years. "I've lived this before," I said. "Once. It ended very differently." She didn't laugh. She didn't call me strange, or ask for details I wasn't ready to give. She simply nodded, slowly, like a woman filing away one more unsolved fact in a life already full of them. "Good thing you got a second draft," she said finally. "Good thing," I agreed. I left the diner that afternoon and drove out past the city limits, toward the small hillside where my mother's original garden still grew, wild now, untended, roses climbing fences nobody had trimmed in years. I hadn't come here once, in either life, without feeling something heavy settle over me. This time was different. I sat down in the grass, sunlight warm across my shoulders, wind moving gently through the overgrown roses. I dug my fingers into the soil without thinking, cool and damp beneath my nails, nothing like cold marble at all. Somewhere far below the hillside, the city kept moving, cars and sirens and closing doors, none of it touching me anymore. The old fear used to live in my chest like a second heartbeat. I noticed, sitting there, that it had finally gone quiet. Not healed exactly. Just settled, the way old ground settles after a storm has passed through it. Somewhere above me, birds moved between branches, calling to each other in the unhurried rhythm of a world that had no idea what it had just survived. The rose scent here was nothing like Diane's, nothing like fear. Just flowers, growing where they'd always been meant to grow. I didn't forgive anyone that afternoon. I didn't feel victorious either. I simply sat in the sun, dirt under my nails, and let myself finally, fully, breathe. There was one truth I understood clearly, sitting there in my mother's overgrown garden. I had never actually given Vivian anything of real value at all. Not the ring, not the company, not even the family name she'd fought so hard to steal. The Hartwell Trust, the only inheritance that ever truly mattered, had been mine, quietly, completely, from the very first morning I woke up 19 again. Everything else had simply been bait, dressed up as generosity, handed to a woman too greedy to ask why it was being offered at all. I stood eventually, brushing dirt from my knees, sunlight warm against my face. I didn't look back toward the city as I walked to my car. There was nothing left there that required my attention anymore. Priya's bread was still warm in my lap when I finally started the car. The smell of it filling the small space, plain and honest and entirely mine. I drove home slowly, windows cracked, wind carrying the scent of cut grass instead of rose perfume for the first time in years. That night I slept without dreaming of balconies at all. No cold marble, no copper taste in my mouth. Just quiet, ordinary darkness, the kind most people take completely for granted. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the universe to give them a second chance. I got mine on cold marble, listening to heels walk calmly away from my body. I used every single day of it. I regret none of it. If you were me, would you have saved her, or walked away? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from?